Water is often seen as a source of life, but in the deep south of the United States, water can be a labyrinth that swallows you whole. The Mobile Tensaw Delta in Alabama is a vast, tangled network of rivers, bayous, and murky swamps that spans over 250,000 acres. It is a beautiful but deeply unforgiving environment. Those who make their living on these waters know that the delta has moods. During the day, it is teeming with birds, fish, and light. But when the sun dips below the cypress trees and the heavy southern heat gives way to the cool night air, the swamp changes. It becomes a place of shifting shadows, disorienting fog, and absolute oppressive isolation. The locals will tell you that the delta has a memory, and sometimes it uses what you love to draw you into its deepest, darkest corners. By the way, as we drift into this dark swamp tonight, I'm wondering where you are listening from in the world right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below because it always fascinates me to see how far these mysteries travel. Let us get back to the water. In the late summer of 2014, a 42-year-old man named Thomas lived a quiet life on the edge of the delta. Thomas was a commercial fisherman who had spent his entire life navigating the intricate waterways of Mobile County. He knew the tides, the currents, and the hidden channels better than almost anyone. He was a man of deep routine, waking up before dawn, taking his small aluminum boat out into the sprawling estuaries, and returning by mid-afternoon. His life was anchored by two things, the water and his wife Clara. Clara was the center of his world. They had been married for 15 years, and despite the rough, weather-beaten nature of his profession, Thomas possessed a profound, quiet tenderness whenever he was around her. Recently, Clara had been bedridden with a severe bout of pneumonia, making Thomas the sole provider and caretaker. He was working extra hours, pushing his boat deeper into the delta to catch enough shrimp and crab to cover the mounting medical bills. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in early September, Thomas decided to push his luck. The catch had been poor all week, and he needed a good haul. He navigated his boat, a flat-bottom skiff equipped with a reliable 40-horsepower outboard motor, into a remote section of the delta known locally as Dead River. It was an area choked with massive bald cypress trees draped heavily in thick gray Spanish moss. The water here was the color of dark tea, stained by tannins from decaying leaves. It was notoriously difficult to navigate, but it was also known for being a prime spot for large blue crabs. Thomas dropped his traps and settled in to wait. He planned to head back by 6:30 p.m., well before the sun completely set. But as any experienced outdoorsman knows, nature does not care about your plans. Around 5:45 p.m., a strange, unseasonable chill settled over the swamp. The oppressive humidity of the Alabama afternoon suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, damp draft that seemed to roll off the surface of the dark water. Thomas pulled his jacket tightly around his shoulders, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He decided to pull up his traps early and call it a day. He hauled the heavy wire cages over the side of the skiff, pleased to find a decent catch, and moved to the back of the boat to start the engine. He pulled the starter cord. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Thomas frowned. He primed the fuel line and pulled again. Nothing. For the next 30 minutes, he aggressively yanked the cord, checked the spark plugs, and inspected the fuel tank. The engine was completely dead. It was a mechanical failure that made no sense. He maintained his equipment meticulously, but right now, sitting in the middle of Dead River, his boat was nothing more than a floating piece of metal. By 7:15 p.m., the sun had dropped below the dense canopy of the cypress trees. The transition from dusk to night in the deep swamp is not gradual. It is abrupt and absolute. As the darkness took hold, the temperature dropped further, and the fog began to roll in. It did not just hover over the water. It seemed to rise from the depths, a thick, milky white mist that clung to the surface and swallowed the roots of the trees. Within minutes, Visibility was reduced to less than 20 feet. Thomas grabbed his heavy wooden paddle and moved to the center of the skiff. He was not panicked yet. He had been stranded before. He knew that if he paddled steadily west, he would eventually hit the main channel of the Tensaw River, where he could flag down a passing barge or another fisherman. But paddling a heavy aluminum skiff through a labyrinth of submerged roots and fallen logs in pitch-black darkness is a monumental task. He paddled for what felt like hours. His shoulders burned with exhaustion, and the blisters on his hands tore open, stinging against the rough wood of the oar. The swamp around him had gone completely silent. That was the most terrifying part. A healthy swamp at night is incredibly loud, filled with the croaking of bullfrogs, the chirping of crickets, and the splashing of fish. But tonight, it was as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the entire world. The silence was ringing in his ears. Every plunge of his paddle into the dark water sounded like a gunshot. He kept his small headlamp turned off to save the battery, relying on the faint, diffused moonlight filtering through the fog. But the fog was playing tricks on his eyes. The hanging Spanish moss looked like twisting bodies suspended from the branches. The ancient cypress knees sticking out of the water looked like jagged teeth waiting to tear the hull of his boat. He realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that he was completely and utterly lost. It was around 11:30 p.m. when he heard the first sound that did not belong to the boat. He had stopped paddling to catch his breath, letting the skiff drift aimlessly in the still black water. From somewhere deep in the fog, off to his left, he heard a distinct splash. It was not the chaotic thrashing of an alligator or the quick flip of a fish. It was a measured, deliberate sound, like something slowly wading into the water. Thomas froze, his hands gripping the paddle tightly. He strained his eyes against the white wall of mist, but he could see nothing. He convinced himself it was just a deer crossing the bayou. He dipped his paddle back into the water and began to row again, trying to put distance between himself and the noise. But 10 minutes later, he heard it again. This time, it was closer. Then, he saw the light. It was a faint, warm, yellowish glow piercing through the dense fog about 50 yards ahead. Relief washed over Thomas, so intensely his knees went weak. A light meant another boat, hunting cabin, or a channel marker. It meant salvation. He dug his paddle into the water with renewed desperate energy, propelling the heavy skiff toward the glowing beacon. He wanted to shout, to call out for help, but something primal and deep within his gut told him to stay quiet. As he drew closer, the fog began to thin just enough for him to make out the source of the light. It was not a cabin. It was not a boat. The light was hovering about 3 feet above the surface of the perfectly still water. It was a pale, sickeningly yellow luminescence, glowing with an unnatural cold intensity. Thomas stopped paddling. The skiff glided forward purely on its own momentum. Slipping silently through the black water, he reached up and slowly clicked on his headlamp, aiming the beam toward the glowing anomaly. The white light from his headlamp cut through the mist and collided with the yellow glow, illuminating a scene that would permanently shatter his understanding of reality. From out of the fog came a voice. "Thomas, baby, are you out there?" The voice was soft, weak, and slightly raspy, as if the speaker was struggling to catch their breath. Thomas felt his heart slam against his ribs with such force it physically hurt. He stopped breathing. The paddle slipped from his trembling hands, clattering loudly against the aluminum hull of the boat. He knew that voice. He had heard that exact tone, that exact inflection every single day for the past 15 years. It was Clara. It was his wife. But Clara was 30 miles away, lying in their bed, sick with pneumonia. There was absolutely no rational, logical, or physical way she could be standing in the middle of the deepest, most treacherous part of the Mobile Tensaw Delta at midnight. "Tommy, please, it is so cold out here. Help me." The voice called out again, and it was so perfectly Clara that tears instantly welled up in Thomas's eyes. The desperation, the subtle southern drawl, the way she shortened his name when she was scared, it was her. His mind violently fractured, desperately trying to reconcile the impossible. Had she woken up, realized he was missing, and somehow gotten a neighbor to bring her out here to search for him? Had they crashed their boat? Was she in the water? Panic, pure and blinding, overtook his common sense. He scrambled to the front of the skiff, leaning over the edge, straining to see past the glare of the lights. He screamed into the fog, his voice cracking with sheer terror and desperation, begging his wife to keep talking so he could find her in the dark. The skiff drifted closer, bumping gently against a submerged log and coming to a halt about 20 feet away from the glowing light. The fog swirled and parted, revealing the source of the illumination and the voice. Thomas gripped the cold aluminum rail of the boat, his eyes wide, his mind unable to process the absolute nightmare unfolding in front of him. It was not Clara. Floating just above the surface of the dark, tea-colored water was a figure. It had the general shape of a woman. But it was horrifyingly wrong. The entity was exceptionally tall, its limbs elongated and impossibly thin, ending in long, pale, dripping digits that brushed the surface of the water. It was draped in something that looked like rotting white fabric, clinging to a skeletal frame. But it was the skin that made Thomas recoil in pure revulsion. The entity was devoid of any color, its flesh a translucent, luminescent white that emitted the sickly yellow glow he had seen from afar. It looked like the belly of a deep-sea fish, bloated and dead, yet terribly alive. The entity slowly turned its head to face the boat. It did not have a face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, pale expanse of glowing skin, marked by dark, shifting veins pulsing underneath the surface. And yet, from that blank, featureless visage, the voice of his beloved wife echoed across the water, perfectly clear and intimately close. "Why did you leave me, Tommy? I am drowning." The words did not come from the air. They seemed to project directly into Thomas's skull, vibrating against his eardrums. The mimicry was flawless, capturing the exact, wheezing sound Clara made when her lungs struggled for air. The entity raised one long, impossibly spindly arm, reaching out toward the boat. The fingers, which looked more like bleached roots than human hands, twitched in anticipation. It was a predator, a monstrous, ancient thing that lived in the deepest rot of the swamp, using the memories and loves of lost men as bait to lure them into the black water. The spell of confusion broke, replaced instantly by the purest, most primal survival instinct Thomas had ever experienced. He scrambled backward, falling over a cooler and landing hard on the metal floor of the skiff. The entity drifted closer, moving without creating a single ripple on the surface of the water. The sickening smell of rotting meat, stagnant algae, and old blood washed over the boat in a heavy, suffocating wave. Thomas grabbed the heavy wooden oar from the floorboards. He did not try to start the engine. He did not try to rationalize what he was looking at. He scrambled to his knees, jammed the oar into the muddy bottom of the swamp, and pushed with every ounce of terrifying strength he possessed. The skiff lurched backward, grating harshly against the submerged stump. "Come back to bed, Tommy. It is so cold." The voice was no longer pleading. It was commanding, laced with a dark, hungry malice that completely corrupted Clara's tone. The entity glided forward, its long fingers brushing the front edge of the aluminum boat. Where its pale flesh touched the metal, a faint hissing sound erupted, and the smell of ozone filled the air. Thomas paddled like a man possessed. He pulled the heavy skiff through the water with violent, desperate strokes, not caring about the noise, not caring about the logs scraping the hull. He just needed to put darkness and distance between himself and that glowing, faceless horror. He rode blindly into the thickest part of the cypress trees, plunging into the dark labyrinth of the delta. He heard the entity emit a sound that was no longer his wife's voice. It was a high-pitched, vibrating shriek that sounded like grinding metal and the dying screams of an animal. The sound echoed through the fog, chasing him through the swamp, threatening to shatter his sanity. He rode continuously for what must have been 6 hours. He pushed his body far beyond its physical limits. His hands were covered in blood, the skin entirely peeled away from his palms, but he could not feel the pain. His mind was locked in a state of absolute hyper-focused terror. He navigated the winding, treacherous bayous using nothing but blind luck and the sheer will to survive. He did not look back. He did not stop to rest. He kept his eyes locked on the dark water immediately in front of his boat, terrified that if he looked out into the fog, he would see that sickly yellow glow keeping pace with him. Around 5:15 a.m., the oppressive darkness of the swamp began to lift. The thick white fog slowly turned into a pale gray mist as the sun began to rise over the horizon. The ringing silence of the night was gradually replaced by the natural sounds of the delta waking up. Birds began to sing, and the water slapped gently against the hull. Thomas felt a slight change in the current. He had stumbled his way out of the dead river and into the moving water of the main Tensaw Channel. 30 minutes later, the massive steel structure of the interstate highway bridge emerged from the morning mist. To Thomas, it looked like the gates of heaven. He aimed his boat toward the concrete pylons and collapsed onto the floorboards, completely exhausted, his body trembling violently. He drifted until a passing commercial barge spotted him adrift and pulled him aboard. The crew of the barge found Thomas curled into a fetal position, his hands bloodied, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blankly at the floor. They towed his skiff back to the marina and called 911. The paramedics treated his hands and evaluated him for severe shock and hypothermia. When the local marine police questioned him about what happened to his engine and how he got so far off course, Thomas just shook his head. He told them he got lost in the fog and panicked. He knew that if he told them the truth about the glowing, faceless woman who spoke with his sick wife's voice, they would lock him in a psychiatric ward. Thomas returned home that afternoon to find Clara resting comfortably in her bed, her fever having finally broken during the night. When she saw his bandaged hands and the haunted, hollow look in his eyes, she asked him what had happened out there in the dark. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, held her warm hand, and wept uncontrollably. He never told her the details. He only told her that he had gotten very lost and thought he would never see her again. Thomas never set foot on a boat again. He sold his skiff, his traps, and his gear the very next week. He took a job at a hardware store in the city, far away from the waterfront. He could not even drive over the bridges that crossed the delta without experiencing a suffocating panic attack. The water, which had once been his sanctuary and his livelihood, was now a source of deep, abiding terror. There is a profound, terrifying vulnerability in loving someone deeply. It creates a connection that defines us, a voice that we would follow anywhere, even into the darkest, most dangerous places on earth. The wilderness is ancient, and it is entirely indifferent to human life. But there are things hiding in the deep, untouched corners of the world that are not indifferent. They are observant. They are patient. They understand what draws us in. And if you ever find yourself alone in the deep fog, and you hear the voice of the person you love the most calling out to you from places they have no business being, do not answer. Do not go toward the light. Just turn around and row for your life.